Christian Michael Longo, born on January 23, 1974, in Ypsilanti, Michigan, seemed like a typical middle-class kid. His family had strict moral principles rooted in the faith of Jehovah's Witnesses, which had a certain influence on Christian's upbringing. This religious community preached modesty, honesty, and selflessness, but Christian himself, as it turned out later, dreamed of a very different life. Christian grew up as the second child in a family of 4 children. His parents strove to instill discipline and a commitment to religious traditions in their children. As a child, Christian showed himself to be an intelligent and inquisitive boy. Teachers noted his ability to learn science and math, and friends said that he was the soul of the company. However, there was something more behind his smile and sociability. From an early age, Christian had a need for recognition and approval. He wanted those around him to see him as a successful, confident person. This desire to be the best seemed to become an obsession for him. The modest life the family lived in Michigan severely limited Christian's ambitions. His parents often explained that luxury and wealth were not something to aspire to. However, as a teenager, he began to think about how to go beyond this simplicity. In 1993, at the age of 19, Christian met 26-year-old Mary Jane Baker. She was 7 years older than him, but their age difference was not an obstacle to the development of a relationship. Mary Jane, like Christian, had been raised in the Jehovah's Witness community. She was kind-hearted, caring, and dreamed of creating a strong family. Their romance developed rapidly. Mary Jane found in Christian a man who, as it seemed to her, could provide stability and a happy life. For Christian himself, this union was an opportunity to confirm his aspiration to the status of a successful husband and head of the family. Soon they were married, starting a life together with high hopes for the future. After the wedding, Mary Jane and Christian moved into a small house. Their life seemed like the fulfillment of a perfect family dream. Over the next few years, they had 3 children, a son, Zachary, and 2 daughters, Sadie and Madison. The Longo family seemed happy and harmonious, especially to those who only knew them on the outside. Mary Jane devoted herself completely to raising her children. She wanted her home to be a place of love and security. Christian, for his part, strove to give the impression of a caring and successful husband. He often spoke of his ambitious plans, which he claimed were to make their lives better. However, behind the outward prosperity lurked serious problems. Christian wanted to live a better life than he could afford. His idea of happiness included expensive cars, fancy clothes, and vacations to the best places. All of this was far beyond their financial means. Christian began engaging in fraud to maintain this image. He forged checks, used other people's credit cards, and constantly hid his machinations from Mary Jane. He believed that these small scams would allow them to live the life he wanted. However, his actions soon began to lead to debt and trouble with the law. By 2001, the Longo family's financial situation had become critical. Christian had accumulated huge debts and his scams began to be exposed. He was caught forging checks, which led to a loss of trust in the Jehovah's Witness community. This was a serious blow to Mary Jane, for she valued their reputation in the religious community. Christian tried to hide the extent of his problems, but the pressure was mounting. Debts, threats of eviction, and constant stress began to erode their marriage. Mary Jane began to notice that her husband was becoming increasingly withdrawn, and his promises to fix their life seemed empty. In an attempt to start from scratch, Christian suggested moving to Oregon. He convinced Mary Jane that it would allow them to put the past behind them and build a new life. She finally agreed, hoping that the move would truly be the beginning of a better future for their family. The family settled in Newport, a small town on the Pacific coast. At first glance, the location seemed ideal: quiet streets, clean air, and friendly neighbors. The Longos rented a house that was clearly beyond their means, but Christian claimed it was a temporary hardship. In the fall of 2001, family tensions were at their peak. Christian became increasingly distant from Mary Jane and the children, spending long hours away from home. His behavior became increasingly mysterious. He could suddenly disappear for hours and return silent and sullen. Mary Jane, according to acquaintances, seemed increasingly depressed. She began to share her worries with friends, saying she didn't know how long she could cope with the growing pressure. However, her faith in her husband and affection for her children prevented her from even considering ending the relationship. December 2001 brought not only a festive atmosphere to the small town of Newport, Oregon, but also one of the darkest stories in its history. The Longo family, who had recently moved to this cozy little town, suddenly disappeared. Their home, which until a few weeks ago had been filled with the laughter of children, now looked empty and abandoned. Neighbors, accustomed to an active and friendly family, began to notice the strangeness, but no one could assume that behind it lurked something terrible. On December 19, 2001, in the early morning hours, a local fisherman went for a walk along the shore of Ypsilanti Bay, enjoying the quiet and fresh air as usual. The day started out calm. The water was still, and the sky was clear. The fisherman, knowing these places like the back of his hand, immediately noticed something strange in the water. At first glance, it seemed to him a sack or a large fish thrown to the surface by the tide. As he came closer, however, he realized that he was seeing something more horrible. The body of a child was bobbing in the water. The fisherman's heart sank. He immediately called the police, reporting the gruesome find. A few minutes later, the first officers arrived on the scene. After inspecting the scene, they carefully removed the body from the water. It was a little boy dressed in pajamas. At first glance, everything seemed to point to an accident. Perhaps the child had fallen into the water and drowned. However, the police noticed strange details. His arms and legs were shackled in an unnatural pose, and there were faint but visible marks on his neck, which were later confirmed by forensic experts. These marks indicated strangulation rather than drowning as the cause of death. The body was identified as 4-year-old Zachary Longo, the oldest son of the Longo family. Police officers began looking around the neighborhood, hoping to find any clues that might explain how the child ended up in the water. However, nothing that could point to the murder scene or the transportation of the body was found. It was as if the water had erased all traces. For the locals, this discovery was the first alarm signal, but no one could yet imagine the scale of the tragedy that was just beginning to unfold. 3 days later, on December 22, 2001, divers continuing to explore the nearby waters of Ypsilanti Bay and the Pacific Ocean came across another horrific find. This time they found the body of a little girl floating near where her brother had been found earlier. Police officers immediately arrived on the scene to record the new evidence and conduct a thorough examination. The body belonged to 3-year-old Sadie Longo, Zachary's younger sister. Like her brother, she was dressed in pajamas, which heightened investigators' suspicions. This circumstance indicated that the children could have been killed at night or early in the morning, when they were probably still asleep. The girl's body, despite being in the water, appeared relatively intact, which allowed forensic investigators to conduct a detailed examination. Forensic experts confirmed that Sadie's cause of death was strangulation, as in the case of her brother. No signs of struggle were found on the girl's body, indicating that she was either bound or unconscious before she was killed. The killer apparently planned his actions carefully to avoid observable evidence that would immediately indicate the violent nature of the death. A particularly important detail was the rope marks on Sadie's wrists. These marks indicated that she had likely been tied up before the murder. This fact became a key piece of evidence because it demonstrated the cold-blooded and calculating nature of the perpetrator. Investigators began to build a theory that the killer was trying to stage a drowning accident, but the inconsistency of details with such a version became obvious. The new discovery strengthened the investigators' confidence that it was a premeditated murder of the whole family. However, the question of the motives and identity of the perpetrator remained unanswered. With each new discovery, the scale of the tragedy became clearer and clearer, but the mysteries only increased. On December 27, 2001, the investigation into the Longo family tragedy took an even more sinister turn. Divers continuing to search the waters of Ypsilanti Bay came across 2 large suitcases lying on the bottom near the Embarcadero Marina. At first glance, they looked like ordinary luggage, but their heaviness and location immediately aroused police suspicion. Divers carefully raised the finds to the surface, after which the suitcases were handed over to forensic experts for examination. When the specialists opened the first suitcase, inside they found the body of 34-year-old Mary Jane Longo, the mother of the family. The sight of her body shocked even the most experienced police officers. Mary Jane's hands and feet were tightly bound, and her face bore obvious signs of strangulation. Judging from the condition of the body, the woman had been murdered several days ago, but the killer had made an effort to disguise the crime. Her clothes were neatly folded, giving the impression of careful preparation and an attempt to conceal signs of violence. The second suitcase contained the body of 2-year-old Madison Longo, the family's youngest daughter. The baby was wrapped in a blanket, which appeared to be both a gesture of perverse care and desperation. Forensic evidence later confirmed that the girl had been killed in the same manner as other family members, by strangulation. Judging by the time frame, her death occurred almost simultaneously with the death of her mother. These findings have raised many questions for the investigators. Why were the children's bodies thrown into the water uncovered, while Mary Jane and Madison's bodies were hidden in suitcases? It could have had to do with the killer's emotional state or his attempts to confuse the police. The suitcases found together reinforced the sense that the killer acted thoughtfully and ruthlessly. The scale of the tragedy became increasingly clear, but the answers to the main question, who committed the crime and why, remained elusive. Each of the finds made by the police had one ominous feature in common. All the bodies had been prepared in such a way as to make it as difficult as possible to locate and identify them. This indicated that the killer acted in cold blood and carefully planned his actions. There were no obvious signs of struggle on the bodies, suggesting that the victims had either been taken by surprise or were in a state that precluded resistance. The locks on the suitcases in which Mary Jane and Madison were found indicated the perpetrator's intention to conceal the bodies securely for as long as possible to prevent their discovery. The suitcases were dumped in the water in places where the currents and depth of the bay made it unlikely that they would be found. This further confirmed that the killer understood how the police worked and was trying to confuse the investigation. However, the bodies of the children, Zachary and Sadie, were left in the water without any attempt to disguise them. This inconsistency did not fit the picture and became a source of many questions for investigators. Why didn't the killer, after acting so methodically with the bodies of the mother and youngest daughter, take the same approach with the bodies of the older children? This may have been an attempt to point out the spontaneous nature of child murders, as opposed to murders that required more deliberate action. Psychologists involved in the investigation have suggested that the differences in the way the bodies were concealed may have been related to the emotional state of the perpetrator. The killer may have experienced guilt or conflicting emotions that prevented him from continuing with a single approach. An alternative hypothesis was that the killer wanted to leave confusing footprints to confuse the police. This contrast between the carefully packed bodies in the suitcases and the bodies of the children left in the water became one of the key mysteries of the investigation. Police continued to analyze each find to see how these details could reveal the perpetrator's motives or point to his identity. The police quickly agreed that this was a mass murder. All the victims had been tied up, killed in the same way, and dumped in the water. However, one thing remained constant. The body of the head of the family, Christian Longo, was nowhere to be found. This fact was key to the formation of the first versions. Police speculated that he might have been another victim. Perhaps his body had not yet been found and he, too, had been murdered with his family. On the other hand, the absence of his body could suggest that he staged the crime himself. As December 2001 drew to a close, the police were focused on finding new evidence. The complexity of the case was that the killer had acted with extreme caution, avoiding leaving obvious traces. Local residents were shocked by what was happening. Newport, known for its safety, was suddenly at the center of one of the most horrific stories in the country. The key question remained: what happened to Christian Longo? Police officers realized that finding him was the next step in an investigation that could possibly uncover the truth. The situation changed when the police began checking Christian's financial activity. Bank and credit card accounts of family members were analyzed to identify possible transactions. To the investigators' surprise, Christian Longo's account remained active. Moreover, it was discovered that he continued to withdraw money and make purchases after the alleged date of the murder. This was the first serious evidence that Longo was alive and at large. Transaction analysis showed that Christian used his card in various places, and even after the police had found his family's bodies. He bought food, small household goods, and clothing from supermarkets and stores in Oregon. Each transaction was recorded, allowing investigators to map out a rough itinerary of his movements. One of the most recent and most significant transactions was the purchase of an airline ticket. Police discovered that on deck 26, the day before the suitcases containing the bodies of Mary Jane and Madison were found, Longo bought a ticket for a flight to Mexico. That purchase put to rest any doubts. Not only was he alive, but he was deliberately hiding. The fact that Longo used his own name to purchase the ticket surprised investigators. This behavior could indicate either his confidence that the police had not yet reached him, or that he did not realize the extent of the operation that was searching for him. The purchase of a ticket to Mexico, however, clearly indicated an attempt to leave the country to avoid justice. In addition, police checked theft footage from the places where he had made purchases. The footage showed that Christian appeared calm and confident. He did not try to hide his face or change his appearance, which further strengthened suspicions that he may have been involved in the crimes. After receiving this information, the police officially changed Christian Longo's status from victim to prime suspect. Investigators concluded that his disappearance after the murders, his financial activities, and his attempt to leave the country could indicate his involvement in the tragedy. To confirm this theory, law enforcement began working closely with federal agencies, including the FBI, and sent inquiries to Mexican migration authorities. The main goal was to prevent him from disappearing outside the country. The police realized that Longo needed to be apprehended as soon as possible. Each new fact related to his actions after the murder strengthened the theory that he might have been responsible for the deaths of his family. At the same time, this behavior raised additional questions for investigators. Why had he left so many traces and made no serious attempts to escape? The breakthrough came thanks to a Canadian tourist vacationing in Mexico. She recognized Longo from photos on the FBI's 10 most wanted criminals list. The woman reported his whereabouts to law enforcement, providing a detailed description. Because of her attentiveness and quick response, the Mexican police were able to quickly organize an arrest operation. On January 13, 2002, Longo was arrested in Tulum, a small town near Cancun. He offered no resistance and appeared calm. A search of his person revealed no weapons, and his documents under a false name confirmed that he was preparing for long-term hiding. Upon arrest, Longo was immediately placed under the jurisdiction of U.S. law enforcement. His extradition to the U.S. went quickly thanks to the coordinated work of the Mexican and U.S. sides. In just a few days, he was brought to Oregon, where he was formally charged with aggravated murder. The arrest of Longo became a high-profile event that caused a huge public resonance. The media covered every step of the investigation, and Longo's name became known throughout the country. His story caused shock and many questions. How could a man who seemed to be a caring father and husband commit such an atrocity? The public, shocked by the brutality of the crime, demanded fair punishment. Initially, Longo denied his involvement in the murders, claiming he had nothing to do with the deaths of his wife and children. However, as evidence accumulated and pressure from the investigation began to change his testimony. In one version, he admitted to killing his wife and one of his daughters, but denied responsibility for the deaths of the other children, trying to shift the blame to his wife. Such contradictory statements raised doubts about his sincerity and made it difficult to establish the real picture of events. Longo sought to portray himself in a more favorable light by claiming that his actions were provoked by external circumstances or an emotional state. He tried to elicit sympathy by describing the hardships his family faced and the financial problems he said led to the tragedy. However, investigators and psychologists involved in the interviews noted his tendency to manipulate and attempt to justify his actions, indicating that he was narcissistic and self-centered. Of particular interest is Longo's interaction with journalist Michael Finkel. After his arrest, Longo, using Finkel's name, made contact with him, offering him an exclusive interview in exchange for writing lessons. During their interaction, Longo provided Finkel with information about his life and crimes, but many of the details turned out to be fictitious or distorted. This interaction formed the basis for Finkel's book and subsequent film adaptation titled The True Story. Analysis of Longo's behavior during interrogations allowed specialists to draw up his psychological portrait. He showed signs of narcissism, lack of empathy, and a tendency to deceit. His desire to control and manipulate others, including investigators and journalists, indicated deep personality disorders. Such characteristics made him a particularly dangerous and unpredictable offender. Christian Longo's trial began in March 2003 in Oregon and immediately captured national attention. The horrific murder of his wife and 3 children, as well as his attempt to flee abroad, made the case one of the most high-profile in the early 2000s. The media and public attention to the trial was overwhelming as people clamored for justice for the brutal crimes. Christian Longo was charged with 7 counts, including 4 counts of aggravated murder. The victims of the crimes were his wife Mary Jane Longo and 3 children, Zachary, Sadie, and Madison. Prosecutors filed charges based on numerous pieces of evidence, including evidence found at the locations where the bodies were discovered, financial records proving his fraud and attempts to hide debts, eyewitness testimony noticing his behavior in the days following the murders, purchasing a ticket and using a false name to flee to Mexico. Forensic experts confirmed that all family members were killed by strangulation, with the bodies carefully prepared for concealment. Longo initially denied his guilt and claimed he had nothing to do with the murder of the children. However, as irrefutable evidence accumulated, his defense strategy changed. During the hearing, he pleaded guilty to the murders of his wife Mary Jane and youngest daughter Madison, but attempted to shift responsibility for the deaths of his older children, Zachary and Sadie, to his wife. This version was rejected by prosecutors and jurors because it contradicted both the evidence collected and expert testimony. Longo attempted to elicit sympathy by describing his family's dire financial situation and the emotional difficulties he faced. However, his behavior, manipulation, and contradictory statements during the interrogations only strengthened the court's belief in his guilt. In April 2003, the jury reached a verdict. Christian Longo was found guilty on all charges. After additional hearings to consider the circumstances of the case and the severity of the crimes, the judge sentenced him to death by lethal injection. This sentence was a reflection of the severity of his actions and the horror they caused in the community. Following his sentencing, Longo was placed on death row at the Oregon State Penitentiary. He appealed repeatedly, arguing that the court should reconsider his case, but all of his attempts to appeal his sentence were rejected. Despite this, Longo continued to be the subject of public interest, especially after the release of journalist Michael Finkel's book and its subsequent film adaptation. In December 2022, Oregon Governor Kate Brown, who opposes the death penalty, commuted his sentence to life in prison without parole. The move drew mixed reactions in the community but finalized his punishment. The trial of Christian Longo was the culmination of a complex investigation and trial. His conviction and harsh sentencing satisfied the public demand for justice, but the tragedy of the Longo family will forever remain one of the most shocking pages in Oregon history. The story of Christian Longo and the tragic death of his family remains one of the most shocking examples of betrayal among loved ones. This case vividly demonstrates how deeply hidden personal issues such as narcissism, financial difficulties, and an inability to deal with the consequences of one's actions can lead to devastating consequences. To others, the Longo family looked perfect: a caring father, a devoted mother, and 3 beautiful children. However, behind the facade of external prosperity hid debts, fraud, and personal ambition, which eventually led to tragedy. Christian Longo was unable to cope with the responsibility placed upon him as head of the family, and instead of seeking legal solutions to his problems, he chose the path of violence and destruction. Longo's trial was a testament to the power of justice. Through the hard work of investigators, prosecutors, and judges, the perpetrator was brought to justice. His guilty plea to the murders, despite attempts at manipulation and blame shifting, confirmed the brutality of his actions. Although his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without parole, his punishment reflects the depth of his crimes. The public reaction to the case reminded us how important it is to pay attention to the warning signs within a family, even when everything looks perfect on the outside. Longo's tragedy shows how critical it is to identify hidden problems in a timely manner and offer support to those who may be in crisis. The deaths of Mary Jane, Zachary, Sadie, and Madison have left an indelible mark on the hearts of their family and friends, as well as those who followed the case. Their story serves as a reminder that dangers can lurk behind the outward smile and seeming stability. This tragedy will forever serve as a warning of what failure to deal with one's own demons can lead to.